star people to the Outlaw Astrology Podcast. I am APM, your intrepid host and guide to the stars. And this episode we're going to talk about the fourth house. And it's a tricky water house, like most houses. But in particular, all the fourth house and the eighth house and the 12th house tend to be rather tricky. So this week we're going to go into that curious mysteries of the fourth house. And if you find the fourth house particularly confounding and puzzling, then please join me for this episode in which we talk about just that. And if you like my astro flow, please like, subscribe, and review and share on wherever you listen to podcasts, in particular Spotify, Apple iTunes, Amazon Music /Audible, YouTube Music, iHeartRadio, Sirius XM, and RSS. And now on with the show. Alrighty, we are talking about the fourth house, and understanding the fourth house, it would help if you understood how we define the fourth house and what the general characteristics are of the fourth house. Generally speaking, it's associated with the themes of home, family, lineage, early childhood, and when I say home and family, I would also say a sense of belonging. It would speak to the themes of early childhood, any nurturing that might have occurred or not occurred, how it occurred, that sort of thing, and the roots in lineage, meaning your way back people, how they might have behaved or how they might behave. And so that's basically what it means. Now the fourth house is tricky, much like the eighth and the 12th, is because it has a deeper psychological and emotional process involved. And what that means is that it has a lot to do with the foundation of who you are. It is your essential self, kind of like the moon. It has an affinity with the moon energy because naturally the moon is said to rule, and I say that with quotes, the fourth house. And so some of the keywords from the fourth house have a lot to do with the moon, which is why nurturing was mentioned, because it has a lot to do with that as well. And so when we're talking about deeper psychological and emotional processes, we're talking also about your safety fears, what makes you feel nurtured. That's all very much fourth house. It's just in a different way, in a more primal way, because it's the where of that energy. How that nurturing happened and what planets happen to be there have a lot to do with, or a lot to say about, nurturing. And via transit, that means planets suddenly having a visit. So during Taurus season, or when the moon is in Taurus, or when any of the planets happen to be in Taurus, that fourth house energy is going to get lit up. It just is. And so that is what the fourth house means. In order to understand it, knowing what that means is very important. So that is the fourth house in a nutshell, quite frankly. So let's step on into signs in the fourth house. So that means we're going to be looking at Aries through Pisces in the fourth house, and we'll do some brief interpretations to give an idea of how this energy might play out. So starting with Leo, since it's Leo season. I just changed my mind right there, did you notice? Anyway, Leo season, we got Leo in the fourth house, we got maybe a creative, a self-expressive energy, meaning this person might have had more freedom to be seen, to be heard, to speak their mind, and to stand out and be able to express who they are exactly as they are in the most authentic fashion. They felt as if their childhood supported and encouraged them to be their most natural selves, which is very healthy for children. On the downside, this person might, or a person with this placement might see other, might be intended or might see the world as all about them. And they might have a bit of a temper, or maybe taught how to express their anger in more reactive ways and rather than responsive ways. And they may have a tendency to overly, focus things on whatever they think, or if the sun is here, or if Mercury is here, what they think, or the sun is, oh, it's about me, or the moon, it's all about my needs, etc. So, when Virgo is here, it's more orderly, a need for order, and an orderly, kind of nitpicky, maybe a little hypercritical, so therefore a little anxious, and analysis paralysis. Because Virgo energy is discerning and exacting and has an ideal, a standard, and maybe those standards and ideals, the downside is they're not always live-upable. You can't live up to them. They're meant to be measuring a measuring protocol or a measuring framework rather than something you're meant to achieve. That means there's perfectionism in a fourth house with Virgo on the cusp. Libra in the fourth house gives us a need for harmony, a need for space, a need for things to be pretty and attractive and harmonious, and so may teach tact and diplomatic skills. But the downside is people-pleasing, and I mean fawning people-pleasing. I don't mean wanting everyone to be happy or doing things because you want people to enjoy themselves or because you do. It's that I must be perfect, and that means I have to give up too much of myself. I have to give up my space, my peace of mind, in order for everyone else to be happy so that I can have a moment of peace to myself. And that is fawning. And that can be unhealthy because it'll inspire or motivate a person, especially if Mars is in Libra here, to be very self-abandoning and self-censoring and self-editing, which is the downside of the sign, which could lead to feeling put upon, which could lead to resentment, especially if that Mars is here and it's retrograde. For example, Scorpio here is very passionate, very intense, loves, intimacy, but there'd be maybe some issues about boundaries here, emotional boundaries in particular, and maybe being very emotionally guarded, a little withdrawn. That's the downside. The upside is the ability for self-analysis, the ability for desire for intimacy, to have a deep connection with your roots and with the people that you call family, but that maybe sometimes emotional vulnerability may not be rewarded. It may be, in fact, punished. That's the downside of Scorpio, but the upside is the passion, the intensity, the drive, the desire for intimacy and vulnerability and transparency, and also a desire to face the unknown and the face-up toolable with courage. Sagittarius here gives us more of a scholarly, philosophical bent, maybe someone with a foreign-born parent if the sun is here, the moon is here, someone who is interested in the pursuit of wisdom, knowledge, truth, and also, downside can be opinionated, preachy, and judgmental, and a bit stubborn. And that's the downside of Sagittarius. Capricorn has been told, has a childhood that's very stable. It is very objective focused. It is the here and now. It is practical. And there is maybe a weighting toward ambition, maybe a ambitious parent, an ambitious sibling, what have you, older maybe, here in Capricorn. So also a certain level of discernment, and since Saturn would rule this house, would be the hard knocks, would be kind of a hard childhood, maybe someone who was forced to grow up a little sooner than they wanted to grow up. That's the downside, which could create broodiness, and maybe someone that is very ambitious and a little cool, and so their personal relationships in childhood might fail. So you might see that in someone who had a parent who was very ambitious, and they didn't get as much of their nurturing time that they would have liked from that particular parent. Aquarius here is eccentric, iconoclastic, and Uranus is the ruler here, so revolutionary and rebellious. So it might be, on one hand, someone who's encouraged to understand what it's like to be outside, to be a misfit, or someone born maybe marginalized, a marginalized voice, a marginalized identity, or at some point being introduced to people of said identities. And more of a humanitarian bent might be involved. But the downside here is being really cool and sometimes a little aloof and disconnected from the family, to one's lineage, family of origin, etc. In addition to that, another downside would be groupthink, meaning that the group has agreed that we're all doing this, and regardless of whatever rebellion you have going on in your head, this is what we're all doing and you're doing it too, sort of vibe. So, reward for being humanitarian and being iconoclastic, certainly, maybe even rebellion, or punished for not conforming to what the group thinks is the right way to be. Pisces is empathetic and kind, so maybe a fantastical, imaginative type of environment where creativity and imagination and fantasy were encouraged, storytelling, fairy tales, things of that nature. Somebody, maybe a creative parent, but the downside is being unattached to this world and wanting to transcend it. So maybe a parent that felt put upon, or a childhood in which the sense was that this person was a burden, or they were being putting upon a caretaker, or the caretaker was fantastical and creative but wasn't particularly practical and had big dreams but may not have put action underneath their feet so as to make those dreams come true, and thereby a sense of frustration and not living in reality would be the downside. And that is moving on to Aries. Aries would be, courageous, independent-minded, competitive, that sort of energy. So maybe someone who is interested in sports, or maybe the military, or some sort of high competition and self-reliance, so some sort of high competition, self-reliant, independent, courageous type of childhood. And the downside is show no weakness, be the first, be the best. It's not possible to be the first and be the best all the time, but that competition could be toxic in that everybody is compared to everybody else. So in this placement, comparisonitis is a commonality. That's the downside. And also feeling that you need to do everything yourself and that you can't ask for support or encouragement or even help when necessary. So it makes you feel quite alone. Taurus is sensuous, full-bodied, embodied, and practical. Somebody with this placement would have a focus on material. The material world would be a high focus on 5 senses plus. The focus would be on also being very practical in the everyday, and the downside, not being particularly open to change, and white-knuckling that change, and also maybe being a bit self-indulgent, which can be problematic. Gemini in this house gives it a chatty, busy, talkative house where there's lots of noise, and curiosity might have been encouraged, and getting information and facts and ideas would be discussed for their own sake. And the downside is, too much facts, too much information, leading to being very scattered, very not pinned down type of energy, perhaps even overextending ourselves with all of this knowledge and all of this curiosity that maybe we don't finish things. We're always chasing after a bright, shiny, new light in the distance. Cancer, 4th house, is a comfortable spot. It's caring, it's nurturing. Ideally, it would be caring, nurturing, and feeling protected and safe. And this childhood, that's what it is. But the downside is the helicopter parent. Someone who doesn't, boundaries might be a challenge emotionally. Someone having a parent or a caretaker not be particularly aware of the difference between nurturing someone and being caring and being protective and making so that they have safety to share their feelings and safety to be themselves and safety to feel that they're cared for, and overdoing that and becoming an overprotective helicopter parent who never lets their children make any decisions and does all of this to mitigate independence, so this person might feel a little too emotionally entangled or attached to other members in the house because emotional boundaries or boundaries at all might be a challenge. See, it's a watery energy with a Cancer placement. And so that is the signs in the house. So let's move on to planets in the 4th house. So the impact of different planets in the 4th house, starting from Sun on out, is what we're going to do, because, once again, Leo season, and we're going to do the common threads and interpretations for each planet, and then personal experiences, if I have any anecdotes tied to those placements. So, the 4th house is, starting with the Sun, okay, private life. Maybe somewhat a little introverted. The whole point of this is to form the experiences that would give a strong sense of self would be 4th house experiences, meaning a connection to tradition, a connection to a parent, meaning maybe the mother or the father, a strong caretaker relationship. Themes would be home and family and belonging and roots and being very much attached to one's traditions. That would be how one's sense of self would be formed. If it's the moon there, we're nurtured by having a home base, and whether or not that home base is a domicile or a place in one's mind, heart, or soul is up to the individual to determine. However, feeling nurtured, feeling cared for by those we have personal, intimate relationships with behind the scenes, so our personal life, which is another 4th house theme, that would be our moon. We needing to feel cared for by those close and whom we feel safe with. If Mercury's there, the focus, all the thoughts, all the thinking will be all about home, family, tradition, belonging, and your roots, and staying connected to those roots. Those would be the thinking. So 4th house planet would not be easily seen from above, and so that means however this person thinks and their motivations are probably not going to be easily influenced from outside. This is an emotional, more of an emotional placement depending on what sign is on the cusp of the 4th house, but it means that this is a very intuitive moon. Guided by their past, guided by maybe a generational thinking or mindset or emotional pattern would guide how this Mercury operates, how it thinks, how it behaves, but it's very behind the scenes. Venus here is family. Someone attracted to people who feel like home, who are family-oriented or who value home, family, belonging, and whose identity is derived from a connection to one's roots, to one's far-back people and one's lineage, etc. Mars here is motivated to protect one's family or to create a family. Regardless of whether or not that is a family of origin or not, the motivation for Mars here is to protect what one considers to be family, what one considers to be home, and to the tribe we belong to, or the kindred we belong to. That's very 4th house, and that's very Mars, to be a guardian and protector to our home, to our family, and to be a gatekeeper to our lineage and to our roots. Jupiter hanging out there is expansive. So it will be expanding through having a deeply enriching personal life, through being generous to family, or friends who feel like family, to be generous, to share the wealth, the abundance, and to help, here, but it would be very behind the scenes. So secretly a very generous person, if we're talking psychological, if we're talking a business chart, Jupiter here would be someone who might be interested in the philanthropic, quietly and behind the scenes. If in a business chart, in a love chart, we're talking about the fourth house, we're talking about personal life, that would be someone who is emotionally generous, is how I would term it, depending on the sign there. And in a career chart, this would be the behind the scenes, your private life, and it means you'd need someone who's generous, gregarious, especially if the sun is also here. Saturn is about boundaries, and it's about limitations and delays. And so Saturn here is somebody who might have felt the need to grow up a lot sooner, someone who was parentified, perhaps, if in a psychological chart, someone who was either A, given boundaries, or too many, too rigid boundaries. And early on, this person would be learning hard lessons, probably before they were ready to understand those hard lessons, but those lessons could result in wisdom. But that doesn't necessarily mean that all hard knock experiences will lead to wisdom. It just means that sometimes it can. When Saturn's here, the hope is that wisdom will occur. Uranus is here in this house, and it's more of an erratic, maybe disruptive house. Yes, rebellion could be a thing. Yes, maybe a very eccentric upbringing, kind of you would write a book about, perhaps. Like running with scissors would be very Uranian, in my opinion, in the fourth house. And here, Uranus is a mixed blessing because it's erratic energy, it's disruptive, it can be chaotic, it can be unexpected and shocking changes, and the fourth house is about roots and lineage and your early childhood, and who wants a chaotic early childhood or erratic childhood? But also it would, in the good side, it would make this person with this placement be open to people who are very different from them, like Jupiter here would do the same, but Uranus would be, you're very much aware of what it's like to be a have-not, which can be a good or a bad thing. The other part of this is that Uranus here, like I said, can be disruptive and can be chaotic. That's the downside, but it can also bring, an eccentricity which would make, or progressive, or humanitarian type of childhood, for example, especially if we're talking about a psychological chart. In a business chart, Uranus there would be systems that would be constantly getting changed because of the erratic nature, meaning that they would need alternative means, alternative structures, and things that could undertake chaos when it happens. And also maybe progressive systems underneath there that other people wouldn't have in a business. In a love chart, it would be the personal life, and that'd be someone maybe at the foundation quietly seeking someone who is a little on the eccentric side. Someone who is comfortable allowing one's freak flag to fly. Being attracted to misfits and rebels and etc. would be one way to read that. In a career chart, the bottom of the chart would be, once again, behind the scenes, your personal life. Uranus here suggests that your personal life might change quite a bit. There'd be a bit of an upheaval quite a bit. In a business chart, it would be rebellion and chaos, which is not a terrible thing, because change is good for systems, but the going through the change is uncomfortable. And then we can look at Neptune. And Neptune here can bring unconditional love, kindness, empathy, and also, on the good side and the bad side, glamour, meaning illusion. You're not certain which way is up. There may be a sense of porousness, a lack of boundaries. It can bring a creative nature, a house with a lot of creativity and a strong spiritual base, or it can bring nebulous, porous boundaries, a shape-shifty quality where you don't know which way is up, what is up down, is down up, what's going on. It's confusion, and also a disillusionment, maybe with the family of origin or maybe with their spiritual practices with Neptune here. It also can be a very creative household, an imaginative household, where stories and imagination is encouraged or punished as the downside. Pluto here is about grief and loss and about power dynamics and agency. So on good side, Pluto here is about learning to use your power and your agency in the right way. But first, in order to do that, Pluto here suggests that you're going to see power and control used wrongly. And this might be someone having undue influence from other people, maybe too rigid, too domineering, too controlling, someone constantly entangled and enmeshed with a person that has this placement, which can be quite painful. And the downside here is also grief and loss, and learning to deal with grief. So that means losses, meaning a death in the family, maybe a pet, maybe a relative, maybe a friend, or maybe just moving away, that sort of death, or different endings and beginnings, and learning to deal with the fact that life is going to have beginnings and endings, and you're going to have to find ways to navigate them as gracefully as you can. And if it's Pluto here, says early childhood, so that's a lot of practice, but first it's going to be very disorienting. Okay? And let's go with Chiron and Ceres and Eris. Chiron here, that's a wound. Childhood wounding, very strong, very powerful, feeling othered, feeling very othered and very different from the people of your family and those who feel like family in the home. And that wounding from childhood has the potential to make this person with this placement a very good guide for other people who have had painful experiences, traumatic experiences from childhood. Ceres here is about nurturing and resources, how you nurture you. And Ceres here is about, fourth house, learning to nurture yourself. So somebody with this placement would have had to learn how to take care of their own needs, or had a parent who was a little too involved with them and overdid the nurturing and protective stuff, and this person had to learn to nurture themselves because their parent wasn't capable of doing it for whatever reason. Eris here is learning to stand up for yourself, which means a very combative, very competitive childhood, and possibly a childhood which a certain narrative went on that this is good and things are great, and then there's a totally different secret narrative going on in which things are it's complete nonsense, this is an illusion, and this person may also have felt like a scapegoat. And that's the downside of the Eris placement. If the North Node is here, the focus is on building and finding a home, a spiritual home or a real home, which would be a domicile and a sense of family that sort of thing, and a tradition to belong to, a lineage to belong to, and it doesn't necessarily have to be one of a blood lineage. It could be found family, found home, etc. The south node here suggests that home and family are already important. They are already something, traditions, things like that, is something, excuse me, I'm about to, excuse me, are already important to this person, and they need to sort out, the 10th house, But here, the foundation is I am already attached to home, a family, nurturing, behind the scenes, private, that sort of thing. I'm already attached to that. I already want that. This is already important to me, so I don't have to work hard to get it. And Black Moon Lilith here is a wounding that the person didn't get the proper nurturing that they would have liked in the way that they would have liked, and their ability to nurture themselves and therefore others is not prime, because they have to deal with those deep emotional issues and those psychological processes that form the crucible, which is the chassis of who they are, because the fourth house is the chassis of the chart, meaning that fourth house signs and planets tell a lot about who you might be on the subconscious, essential nature level. So it speaks a bit to temperament, okay? And that is planets in the fourth house. So we're going to do a chart example segment here, and I'm going to show a chart of a groovy person, and that groovy person is usually going to be a thinker or someone like that. And I have a lot of charts where I just look at different people, different planets, in different charts to see, is there anything curious, anything interesting? I think I have one. So, this is the chart of Alvin Ailey. And let's do the about. So, Alvin Ailey is Alvin Ailey Jr., an American dancer, director, choreographer, and activist who founded the Alvin Ailey American Dance Theater, otherwise known as AAADT. And he created AAADT and its affiliated Alley School as havens for nurturing black artists and expressing the universality of African-American experience through dance. So he infused his work with theater, modern dance, ballet, jazz, and a bit of the black vernacular, and creating a kind of a hope-filled, inspiring choreography. And the whole point was to spread global awareness of black life in America. So his choreographic masterpiece was called Revelations and is recognized as one of the most popular and most performed ballets of the world. And this is from Wikipedia. Let's step into his details. So he's born on January 5th, 1931 at 5:30 a.m. in Rogers, Texas, in the United States. And he is a Capricorn Sun, a Cancer Moon, and a Sagittarius Rising. He is also a full moon child, and the chart signature tends toward the mutable, and in particular tends toward fire, so very Sagittarian. He's flexible, versatile, inspiring, and enthusiastic. I like to see if there's any charts, any planets out of bounds. And his moon is out of bounds by 25 degrees north, 39 minutes, 9 seconds. And let's get back to the chart. So in his fourth house, he doesn't actually have anything going on, which is not terrible, because I did an episode about this a bit ago, which I will link in the show notes. His fourth house has Pisces on the cusp with his IC, that means his Imam Quelli, is at 29 degrees, 18 minutes in the 4th house. Very Piscean, so very creative, very sensitive, very wanting to transcend his current circumstances, as in being an African American or a black person in the USA. Being born in 1931, he would have lived through the civil rights era and would have had to deal with what it was like to be a person of color during that time, or a person of the global majority at that time, which was quite painful, brutal, and also highly challenging. And this tells me that he had opportunities to be creative, to be imaginative, to maybe even live in a fantasy realm, which his work speaks of the fact that he used dance to tell stories, but also used dance in a way to transcend, because Piscean energy is also a bit spiritual. It wants to transcend. So there's no planet hanging out there. So I'm going to go look for Neptune, which is hanging out in the opposite sign of Virgo. And by the way, Virgo in the 10th house, by the way. And that is not a comfortable placement for Virgo, because Virgo is in its detriment in with Neptune is in its detriment in Virgo, because Virgo is the polar opposite sign of Virgo. Polar opposite sign. Virgo is the polar opposite sign of Pisces, so Neptune here would be in detriment, so it'd have to work a little harder in the 10th house. This is a earthy energy, a nocturnal energy being put onto the world stage, so not entirely comfortable. I'd say probably that he was very exacting in his work. He had a framework he worked with, and he had standards of perfection that he was trying to achieve. And since that is, if that's likely, it's unlikely those standards would be achieved, and there might be some mild anxiety about that, around those issues. And that means that Mercury is calling the shots. So the 4th and the 10th are tied together as polar opposites, and that means that this person's private life is going to be very sensitive, very need for empathy and kindness and creativity, and a need to step back to create. And that exacting nature will then step into it as they question whether or not what they do is standing up to their own standards. And the Sun is in the 2nd house, and so is Mercury, and so those standards are there's an objective. And the objective is to transcend circumstances and transcend the image of people of color at that time, to show that creativity, imagination, etc. is also possible. And that Mercury is connected, aligned with the Sun at 14 degrees 10 and Saturn at 14 degrees 14, and that's in the 2nd house, which means working for the money, because this is Saturn ruled, and Saturn is in that house, in the sign that rules. So this is a very strong 2nd house. Saturn is in domicile in Capricorn, and it is not retrograde. However, Mercury is. So Mercury here is more of a scholarly type of person, a person who would think before they spent money. So one of the strengths is being able to be practical, be responsible, be serious, maybe a firstborn child, or a child made to, one of their strengths was to be precocious and very adult-like, but also someone with an objective, So this ability to have Capricorn here means someone who can have an objective, someone who would be focused, responsible, and maybe a little over-serious. And since this is also the money house and Saturn is here, there's going to be hard knocks when it comes to money. And dance is not known to provide wealth historically. And so there'd be some hard knocks where it comes to money and needing to budget, etc. So, and that's just to give you an idea. The Sun here is, like I said, ambition. An ambition and driven person who has an objective to transcend their circumstances. Okay? And that Sun, is in very earthy, so practical, on the ground, day by day, etc. approach. And this is just to give you an idea. By no means is any of the interpretations in this particular episode meant to be exhaustive. They're merely meant to point a finger and say, this is how you could do it, this is how you could see it. So, that is the key point I want to share here. So, by no means should you ever look at a chart and say, oh my God, this is the way it is. So my interpretations, though cookbook-like, were not meant for you to read those and go, hey, that's how it is. So instead, you're meant to look at your chart and look at the planets in the fourth and reflect on how those planets might be influencing your life. Until next time, keep looking up and exploring the mysteries of the stars.